Your boss is spying on you.
Well, at least if you work at one of the 80% of companies that employ workplace surveillance.
That's right. We're talking workplace surveillance, what it is, and what you can do about it on today's episode of Per My Last Email. Let's get into it. Kayla, have you heard about the lawsuit?
Which one? Yes, maybe.
I check every lawsuit that happens every single day. Takes up my whole day. No, Apple is being sued by one of its employees for basically workplace surveillance.
Okay.
This employee who I think still works at Apple, so I'm not sure like what the break room vibe is like right now.
All right.
Basically is accusing Apple of forcing or coercing or encouraging employees to use their personal device at work and then not to have a separate iCloud account for work, so using their personal iCloud account. And therefore, as a employee policy, Apple can theoretically track everything you're doing at work, at home, 24/7. They have access to your keystrokes, the emails you're sending, what apps you're using, even if they're personal apps they're using in your personal time. And he's basically saying like, this is like coercive. This is a restriction on my freedom as an employee. It's a violation of my privacy rights. Apple is denying that like there's anything really illegal about this. He also is saying that Apple discourages people from talking about their salary. Apple has denied that. But I found this lawsuit very interesting because it's getting to this point of workplace surveillance and what companies know about you, what you're doing online, and if they are using that information against you in any sort of way. And we're seeing this as a trend increasing, mainly because of like work from home and just digital tools becoming more and more common.
Yeah. Okay, I have a few hot takes. First,
Okay.
I don't agree with what Apple is doing. I think that's important to state. But if a company gives you a company computer, a company work phone, they have paid for this, and it is explicitly, this is your work device, I think it's actually kind of fair for them to surveil what goes on on that laptop.
Yeah. I mean, so exactly, you're right. Like they're not like legally forcing you to do this. The lawsuit is saying like they just kind of like discourage you from using the work device. And if you use a work device at Apple that they provide you, it's heavily restricted because they don't want you going on like personal apps.
Right.
And so then it just becomes a nuisance. Like if you're at work, like you want to check your Instagram, I gotta go get another phone. Like
this is what I don't understand.
But you have that option.
You have that option.
Yeah, exactly.
So then you can take that option. What I don't understand is, okay, you have to do work on your work computer. You want to look at Instagram, go to your personal phone.
Yeah.
And open Instagram.
Yeah.
Like, it's not like, oh, it's so restrictive. I can't do personal shit during the day. Like, yeah, of course that they're going to restrict the computer that they give you.
Yeah, you know, I'm not sure this lawsuit's going to work, but they did bring in a superpower lawyer that sued Uber for like workplace violations as well in the past. So they have, it seems like a serious bench. Again, Apple's denying that this is even like wrong in any way, shape, or form.
Yeah.
But I want to talk about the broader concept that this lawsuit illuminates, which is how much employers know about you as an employee in and outside of work, and the new technologies that are coming online that allow employers to have a much better sense of what you're doing basically 24/7. Boeing was also in the news recently. They were going to install at like each of their offices like 2,500 sensors that would monitor how much a room is being used, take photos of everyone all the time. And their position on this was like, we're not actually tracking you. We're just seeing like which rooms are being used. We're using this to like increase energy usage or decrease energy usage if rooms are being used heavily or not so heavily. But employees are like, yeah, I don't want cameras everywhere. This just feels like Big Brother. And they actually canceled the program about 24 hours after they announced it due to some reporting at the Seattle Times. And so there's wide employee pushback about even the option that this could be used and abused by Boeing, and they pulled the plug. And I think we're just seeing more and more companies use these technologies.
Yeah, okay, so a few things on that.
'Kay.
First of all, again, I think that a company, it's their space, they've paid for the office. Like, it's fine. I actually don't see a problem with a company wanting to do that.
Yeah.
Where I think there's an issue is, for example, when that infringes upon your personal life. If Apple is saying, I'm not giving you a computer, you have to use your own, and I'm going to be able to monitor everything that happens there, I think that's obviously not good.
Right.
And I think that should be illegal if it's not. Like, that shouldn't be allowed. With the Boeing stuff, I think I understand, and that points to one of the tactics that we're going to talk about later.
Yeah.
Which is like, if you as an employee are actually upset at something that your company is doing and you're not alone, like you have power.
Yeah.
Like, you can push back against policies that you believe are infringing on your personal rights.
Yeah, the Boeing Slack was apparently like popping off. People were like, Big Brother is watching. And employees did basically tell all of their managers, like, we're not doing this.
Of course.
And they did cancel the program. So you can, in solidarity, maybe fight back against some of these policies.
Collective action. We'll talk about that a little bit later.
So the last thing I want to bring up just to set the scene here is the American Bar Association, which is apparently a group of a bunch of lawyers.
Well, what do you mean apparently?
The super nerds got together, Kayla. And they said 80% of major companies use workplace surveillance, and it's pretty pervasive. This is internet use, software downloads, what files you have on your computer, all your keystrokes, the emails, and all of this is, to your point, legal.
Yeah.
The American Bar Association is not like, and we're suing them and this is illegal. Right. They're saying you kind of give up some rights once you sign an employment contract with your employer, but they just wanted people to know that this is very, very common across all companies, basically.
Yeah, that makes sense. And I'm not saying it's right, but I'm saying it makes sense that a company would want to understand what's going on technology or products that they're providing their employees.
My question is, though, like, does this actually work? Because, you have the right to do it. But what I think is interesting is, are employees going to perform their best when they feel like Big Brother is watching?
No, of
when they
course not.
feel like they're being surveilled. And literally, as it said, Entrepreneur did this survey. 78% of employers say they use this. 83% of those that say they use it believe it is ethically questionable. And there's like a ton of reports on how employees feel about it. 60% of employees reported that it made them feel anxious. And so you're creating a culture in which it feels like you're always being watched. And I think that actually starts to skew what you care about. And so instead of like doing good work, feeling relaxed, feeling comfortable, feeling like you're all on a team, you feel watched. And so you start skewing your behaviors to like make your mouse jiggle. So it seems like you're on Slack, have something that just you're typing keys randomly. So it feels like you're active, which you're not actually creating the best conditions for your employees to thrive.
So a few things.
Yeah.
There's a lot in there. First, I think we should define what workplace surveillance means that when we're talking about it here.
Yeah.
Because you're mentioning a lot of like software, a lot of technology. I think there's two main types of surveillance that we're seeing. There's physical surveillance. This is like, the news that you've seen about Amazon warehouses basically tracking every step of each employee.
Yeah. But they're using software to do that.
Right. Yes, of course. But it's physical labor that is being tracked.
Yeah.
Versus software surveillance, which is basically I'm giving you a computer and now I can see what you're doing when you're on that computer.
Yeah. There's tracking you and there's tracking what you're doing online.
Right. And I think that the software surveillance, which is a little bit more of an all-encompassing bucket, we should talk about a little bit more. Second, you're talking about, is this ethical? And I think I don't think it matters.
Yeah.
I think that I
feel like I'm back in philosophy class. Let's go.
No, I just don't know why we're debating. And I've seen this when I was doing research for this episode. I was thinking about this a lot too. I saw this pop up. Like, this isn't ethical. This isn't. It doesn't matter if they're providing you with why are we a company isn't ethical? Like, they're doing things that aren't for the best. Besides our shareholders. I'm not surprised by that.
Yeah, I know. I don't think the question is this ethical or is it not ethical? I think what's telling about that is the people actually implementing the policies. 83% of them think this is questionably ethical, which just it begs the question, why are we actually doing this? I feel like we've gotten ourselves into a position where we're doing something and it doesn't work. Employers apparently don't feel good about doing it. Employees don't like it. It's not shown to increase productivity. So my question is, why is this exponentially growing?
It's because I'm going to say this with confidence.
Yeah. We've actually solved this on this podcast.
It's because the management class feels like they are losing value.
Yeah.
And the way back in the olden days, pre-2020, the way that the management class felt like they were adding value is by surveilling, walking around behind people's desks, talking to people, see what they're doing. But that doesn't mean that that people's productivity has necessarily changed. It's not like you were when you're in the office, you're working really hard. No, you're getting really good at switching tabs quickly.
Yeah.
Or
I'm so good at that.
Right, figuring out oh, boss is coming, gotta figure out how to look like I'm busy, like the Tyra Banks, like typing. It's just like letters going on.
Do you remember during like March Madness, there was literally a thing you could press a button and a spreadsheet would pop up?
No,
if you were watching, it's like a perfect example of like, you're finding ways to hack the system.
Exactly. But it's like, okay, as a manager, if I was a manager in, let's say 2015, I felt like I was doing my job by seeing what people are doing and monitoring and saying, I see that Kyle is talking to Robert.
Yeah.
And that means that they're working.
Yeah.
And
I do that often.
Yeah. It's your boss. But I think that the only way that I can continue to add value as a manager is to still do that watching.
Yeah.
Then, of course, people are working from home. Well, I'm giving them this computer and I have the technology to see what they're doing. Of course, I'm going to feel like the only way that I can add value is to continue to do that surveillance.
Yeah.
But it just gets more and more like invasive.
Yeah. I totally agree. I actually think that is like the right answer of why this is. I don't think it's like, managers are like evil or like,
No.
I think it's just a thing about incentives. And in this entrepreneur study, they said 85% of leaders blame hybrid work for affecting their ability to see who is like productive or not. Yeah. And so I think as we've moved to hybrid work, as digital tools have just grown in our ecosystem, we've lost a heuristic.
I have it written down here.
We need a bell. We've lost the heuristic for managers to say like, yes, this person is being productive or no, they're not. And instead of being like, okay, let's rethink what productivity means. We should be assessing output and quality of output.
Yep.
Instead of doing the hard work to like realign culture around that, I think a lot of companies are just taking the shortcut, which is, no, let's just like focus on inputs. And if they're typing a lot of keys, they must be productive. And we need a way to measure that. Yep. So that is why I think there's been like an explosion of these tools. And it's unfortunate because it seems like it's not working for anyone.
Yeah, it's lazy management.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, like I literally wrote that down. It's like we used to have the FaceTime heuristic.
Mm-hmm.
And now that is less obvious to us, we are like, okay, what's the easiest, the next closest thing to that? Oh, how often this person is online pressing buttons. But as we know, this is probably like the 8th time I've said this. What gets measured gets managed.
Yeah.
What gets measured gets managed.
Yep.
If what you're measuring is like a number of hours on pressing buttons or whatever, or number of emails sent, for the most part, there are some like cold call, whatever, like that is a product that is output. What you're doing is you're encouraging busy work. Mm-hmm. You're encouraging people to game the system in a way, like for example, like whatever, like moving your mouse every so often to stay green.
Yeah.
That's not exactly like a software that surveils your actions. But if I'm on Slack and I see that somebody's consistently offline, I'm like, what are they doing? Mm-hmm. And it's easy as a manager to be like, that means that they're not working.
Yeah. I think the big takeaway for me, at least from this first part of this episode, is that like it is a culture thing. And I think we implement some of these tools sometimes thinking, okay, like this is going to give us better insights into what our employees are doing without realizing it's going to change what employees do. Yeah. To your point, like if you're now measured on how active you are on Slack, you're going to spend a lot of time. They did a study where like employees were actually spending up to an hour a day just gaming the system if they were being surveilled. You're going to spend all day finding out how to stay green on Slack instead of deep thinking about big problems that the company needs to solve. And so you just have to be very careful that any tool you introduce is going to affect the culture, and it's probably going to affect it in a negative way if it's skewing it to these weird incentives. Do you feel, I also think another theme here is just like work and life are just splashing together. Mm-hmm. And we've done so many episodes where like, if you're working from home, now your living room is also your office.
Right.
You don't even have a work computer. Your personal computer is your work computer. Like we are just taking these two things that used to be very distinct, very separate. You would drive to an office, you would drive home, you couldn't communicate unless you got a fax machine. And now we're 24/7 work and life. And I think this is just an outgrowth of that. Do you feel like stressed by it? Let's just take your computer, for example, like that your work and life are like so blended. Or are you comfortable with that?
Yeah. So basically what Kyle's referring to is the fact that I do not have a personal computer. And so we talked about this in a previous episode. I literally have my Twitter up on my personal like Chrome account.
Yeah.
That doesn't, I'm using the company computer.
I did this for 3 years too.
This is not like ideal, certainly. But also Morning Brew does not employ these workplace surveillance tactics. So, or any software. Another thing to mention
that you know of.
That I know of, but I think they would disclose that. And also, it's like extremely expensive to get these softwares implemented. So that's another thing that we can talk about. But no, I don't feel weird about it at all. First of all, I'm not like doing anything weird on my work computer. I think that it's like I've already blended my work and my life so much that just the physical technology blending as well is like, well, whatever.
Yeah, I hear you, and I do the same too. Like my phone has work stuff on it, it has personal stuff on it. I think it's actually way more common. A lot of my friends just have one laptop, and a lot of my friends just have one phone, and they're definitely using their phone for work and for personal life. And I think it makes sense, but I'm just curious of like in 5, 10, 15 years, like if the trends continue and these things in our life get much more blended, what the effects of that will be, because I think that is a trend we're going to continue to see accelerate.
And we'll be right back after this. Okay, back to the show.
The other thing I want to talk about, like workplace surveillance, we've talked so much about companies using these tools. Boeing, Apple, you name it. There's some workplace surveillance going on, again, at 80% of companies. I think there's a difference between having the tool and then actually using the tool every day to like assess what your employees are doing. And my guess is a lot of these companies have the technologies that track, but they're not hiring someone to look at this every single day.
I disagree.
You disagree?
Yeah.
You think someone's like looking at every single keystroke all the time at all these companies?
No. I think probably the reason why these technologies and these softwares are so expensive is because they aggregate and they highlight problems.
Yeah.
So you are paying for the technology to tell you who's a problem. Mm-hmm. It's not like, oh, we're going to hire a, Kyle work, computer use monitor.
Yeah. That's my official title here.
It's like, oh, we're going to use whatever software. I actually don't even know what they're called.
Yeah.
Use whatever software. And then every 3 weeks, I'm going to get a little ping like, hey, I've noticed that Kyle's, time online has has decreased by 15%. Maybe it's worth digging into. And then you click into it and then you can see, oh, that's so interesting. He's taking an exceptionally long lunch. I wonder what's wrong.
He's been on twitter.com for 18 hours today. What is going on?
Exactly. But it's also, I think one of the things, again, what gets measured gets managed.
Yeah.
And I think that it's really interesting that these types of softwares exist, which then implies that the only way that you can be doing work is if you are on your computer.
Yeah.
And one example of that, just talking personally, like I am definitely somebody who feels like I need to be, because I came up in the world where FaceTime was the heuristic for I am working hard.
Yeah.
And it was like kind of like beaten into me at my first job. Mm-hmm. If I'm not there before my boss and if I'm not leaving after my boss, like I have failed as my job as an analyst. So for me, I feel very, very self-conscious about that green bubble going away. So for example, we just launched a crossword book.
Yeah.
And part of that was me editing the book. And so I printed it out and I had a physical copy of the draft and I was going through like literally
You were doing like hundreds of crosswords a day.
Doing hundreds of crosswords.
Yeah.
101 actually.
You started speaking in only clues to me. I was like, what is going on here?
It was so hard because I was making sure that every clue was correct, all the, everything made sense before we published it.
Yep.
But I wasn't online, but I was doing really, really important work. And I found myself sitting hunched over my desk, moving my mouse so that I could still be online. And I was like, everybody knows I'm doing this work offline. I've told
Kayla,
everybody.
There's a thing where you could just set your status on Slack, just doing crosswords.
I had already done that.
Oh my gosh.
I had already done that for like, I was probably 10 days where I was spending like 2 or 3 hours a day, like deep work offline.
Yeah.
And I would still move my mouse.
Yeah.
And I'm not saying that that's like right. I'm just saying that it's like so deeply ingrained.
No one thinks you're saying this is right. I just think it's a perfect example that we've created a culture in which you feel like you have to do that. And I'm not calling out Morning Brew. I'm just saying in general at work, it feels like, okay, I'm going to be measured if like my Slack is green or if I'm just like looking busy rather than producing great work.
Yeah.
And so then everyone just focuses their time on looking busy.
Right.
And it's disastrous. You're going to get...
And I actually think it took me longer to finish the crossword edits because every 15 minutes I was like, oh, gotta press some keys.
Yeah.
Again, not because Morning Brew is tracking me, but I think that in companies where you are being tracked, it's even more pervasive. And the chances that you're going to be reading a book that like maybe is relevant to your career or going to meetings is less. You're just going to be constantly trying to make sure that you're doing as much stuff online as possible.
Yeah, I mean, it's also interesting. I think this goes to even your calendar. Like some days I just won't have a meeting, or I'll have like 1 or 2 meetings.
Yeah.
And some days you have like 10. And then the day you have 2, I'm like, oh, like it looks like I'm not doing anything. But those are actually the days where you can get a lot of stuff done, because breaking news, work sometimes requires like sitting alone in a room and thinking and researching and writing. And I do think, unfortunately, work has become a place where that behavior is harder to like track or harder to talk about how productive you're being when you're like, yeah, I sat in a room for 2 hours and like wrote a paragraph, but I was thinking a lot.
Yeah.
People are like, that doesn't count.
Right.
And so we're like moving in this direction where you want more meetings, you want to be pressing a lot of buttons, and you add in workplace surveillance to that. And I think we're just creating very bad cultures. Also, my question is just like, why are you hiring people that you think you need to surveil?
Yeah.
Like, isn't this just an issue with like, if you hire smart people that are good people that you trust and you create a culture around that, you shouldn't need to surveil them. And you should empower managers to like have difficult conversations with people if you think their output is bad. But measuring all of these inputs all the time, I think produces subpar outputs, which ultimately matter.
Yeah, and I think when you're thinking about those 2 different types of surveillance
Yeah.
that I had mentioned earlier, physical surveillance is like how fast is worker A putting, Tide pens into box. And it's basically saying like, I view your output as like no better than like a robot, and therefore I need to optimize. And I think there's clear issues with that.
Yeah.
What's interesting is that it takes the like quote unquote knowledge worker that doesn't have exactly physical outputs.
Yes.
Like number of Tide Pods packed.
Yes.
And it's like, how do I create a physical output associated with each job? And what that does is that almost like removes the humanity from both ones, from both types of surveillance. But I think that's not what we want at all. Like, it's just going to create like busy work and busy work.
It's such a good point, Kayla. Like, if you think, even take my job, for example, like chief of staff.
Yeah.
I don't really have like an output that comes out every day that someone's like, you did your job. Think about this podcast. Like every Monday it comes out and people are like, Kyle and Kayla did that.
Yeah.
Nice. All the other podcasts we have here. I don't have that as a chief of staff. And I think a lot of people, unless you're in basically like sales where it's like a quota and you just measure that and you're good or you're not, like you don't have this output that's clearly yours that someone can say you did this wholly, because it's collaborative. You're working across functionally. You're working on a lot of initiatives. And so if you can't measure output, I think as a manager, you start to think, okay, I have to measure them somehow. Let me look at the inputs. And so then you're like, okay, they're in a lot of meetings. I see them at the office. They're touching their keys a lot. That must be good.
Right.
And so it is just tough if you are quote unquote a knowledge worker to articulate clearly in a well-defined way what your output is and the value you're bringing to a company. And I think that's a tactic we've talked a ton about here, is like make your job less fuzzy. I think workplace surveillance is like is a symptom of like a much bigger problem, which is sometimes it is actually hard to measure what you're contributing. And I think as an employee, if you want to protect yourself and you want to demonstrate value, get really good at articulating what your outputs are, how they're helping the company succeed, how they're driving revenue, because otherwise they're going to use these heuristics, which we're seeing are not actually that good.
Yeah. And I think, but like for as long as we've had work, like knowledge work, we've had heuristics.
Yeah.
Again, we're like beating.
But I think knowledge work has only grown exponentially since even by the time we're alive. There used to be jobs, we were talking about this like as like in the 1900s, 1800s, that were a lot more like output focused. If you're like on a factory line or you're putting pens in a box, they can just look at how many pens you put in a box.
Right.
If you're just like plugging away, hitting keys all day, and then like things happen, like it's a lot harder to actually measure, which is the point I'm bringing up, which is why I think these technologies are taking off.
Yeah, again, just because they're taking off doesn't mean that they're right. Like
no one's saying that.
With that 100%.
Yeah.
In terms of tactics,
okay,
maybe let's go into that.
Okay.
As a company, I think the first tactic that I have is don't do this.
Yeah.
Like, don't take the lazy route. You're going to spend more money on the software to track your employees. Your employees are going to feel worse.
Yeah.
They're going to optimize for the wrong things.
Can I say one thing based on this?
Yes.
Because I think this is another reason why companies do it or HR does it. This is very good at allowing you to get rid of bad employees.
Yeah.
Because you have a paper trail. You can be like, you haven't logged in 7 days. Like, come on.
But hear me out. Hear me out. In 7 days.
Someone should know that somehow. I know, but hear me out. Hear me out. This is a way to have a paper trail to get rid of bad employees. And I think I understand the use case for that. This is terrible for good employees.
Yeah.
People that are like showing up, they care, they want to do great, they want to grow in their career, they're working hard. Like, to surveil them is creating a terrible culture. But I think we have focused on how do we get rid of quote unquote bad employees? How do we have a paper trail if we need to get rid of someone? Instead of thinking about how do we create a culture where like good people feel like they belong, they want to be here, they're given autonomy, they're given freedom. So I think we've just chosen the wrong path.
Yeah.
And instead of being like, look, sometimes we're gonna have bad employees and they might skate under the radar and we can't get rid of them. But we're going to celebrate and we're going to create a culture where like people that want to show up but don't want to be surveilled can thrive. We've done the exact opposite, which is like we're going to make sure we know exactly what every employee is doing so we can get rid of bad ones. And I think that's the wrong choice.
Yeah. It reminds me actually of this quote that one of our old bosses used to say, which was, in terms of developing your employees and focusing on the high performers and training and developing your employees, it's like, well, what if they leave?
Yeah.
And it's like, well, what if you don't train them and they stay? Yeah. It feels very similar to that. It's like, okay, if you're optimizing for the bad apples, then you're going to have those higher performers either stick around and feel like they're not reaching their potential, optimizing for the wrong things, not being good employees because you've basically managed them to be worse.
Exactly.
Or they're going to leave.
Yes. Sorry, I had to go on that rant.
Okay, so anyways.
Back to tactics.
Don't do it. Don't employ workplace surveillance. Don't take the lazy route. That's my final piece of advice for an employer.
Yeah.
As employees, you may not have the ability to direct whether or not these policies get implemented, but if everyone's unhappy with it, you can push back. You do have power as an employee, right? Like, collective action is a thing. You can say, I am not happy with the fact that there is workplace surveillance. I think that I'm doing a good job. And if you get enough people that agree, enough employees that agree with that, you can do like what happened at Boeing, which is that enough people were upset. It was clearly a bad policy and they took it away.
Yep.
So that is, as an employee, you are not helpless.
Yeah.
You can do things.
I totally agree. And in this entrepreneur survey, it said 60% of tech workers would actually reject a job offer where they thought workplace surveillance would be like too powerful. And again, I think if I was an employee and I wanted to like not have my company implement these policies, I think all you need to do is say, hey, our incentives are aligned. We both want to be a great company, work at a great company, make a ton of money, and look at all the stats that show that workplace surveillance actually disincentivizes good employees from doing their job well. Like, we don't actually want this the company for business reasons. And I think you have a really strong argument if you go that route. My tactics, employers, I think you have two paths. One is like you bring on all this workplace surveillance so you can like monitor all of your employees and you feel like you're in control and you can get rid of like bad actors, quote unquote. Or you can really work hard on empowering managers to like find ways to actually assess talent in like a holistic way, to actually look at outputs that matter. And I think in that way, you're going to create a culture. Like, I understand why you're using workplace surveillance. It's like a little easier, but I think you're going to build a better company and a happier company if you do this other path. And for employees, I think you're spot on. Like, you do have power to like flag this to your manager. That's how the Boeing thing went away. And so if you're uncomfortable with this, definitely make your voice heard. I would say I also found out Bevy machines.
Oh, God.
This is not an ad for Bevy. I do love the machines, though. They have.
What are they?
They're bubbly water machines.
Yeah.
We have one at Morning Brew. Shout out to, I think it's blood orange flavor, sparkling. So good. Even they can track like how much like water is being used. So like I guess theoretically you can see like when the first employee comes in and grabs water and when the last employee leaves.
This is so dumb. Why are we talking about this?
I think maybe another thing that's like not good or bad, just like true, is like everything is kind of connected to the internet now and is being tracked. So like we have a ton of data. So sometimes it looks like workplace surveillance, but it is just a water machine. And like, I don't think your company is using the water machine to make any decisions.
Or maybe they are, in which case you're effed.
Yeah, if that's the case, you got to get out of there ASAP. But yeah, shout out to Bevy. The water's quite good. All right, should we roll the credits?
Let's do it.
Our producer is Michaela Heck.
Our technical director is Shannon Woku.
Emily Milliron is our executive producer of Morning Brew Daily and guest producer for today's show.
And our chief content officer is Stephen Emery.
This show is a production of Morning Brew.
Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next week.